everybody. I'm Aaron Simmons. This is Philosophy for Where We Find Ourselves, June 20th, 2023. I often get asked by people, how can I get started in philosophy? What book would you recommend to somebody who's not an expert? And when I get asked this question, I often recommend the book that I use in almost every class I teach as the way of getting students invested in philosophical inquiry. So today what I thought I would do is recommend that book to you and then offer maybe a couple other things that I think can help you get started in philosophy without a big philosophical background. Now, the book that is simply a game changer to me, and it has transformed my teaching, it now becomes the first thing I do in all of my intro to philosophy classes, is This Is Water by David Foster Wallace. What this is a commencement address that David Foster Wallace gave at Kenyon College. And this address starts by introducing us to a kind of didactic little story, he says, about two fish swimming along. And an old fish swims up to these two young fish. The old fish looks at the two young fish and says, "Hey boys, how's the water?" To which the two young fish look at each other and say, "What the hell's water?" So this starts Wallace's account. And in 30 minutes, this, again, graduation speech, what he does is, I think, invites us to live philosophically. And he does this without ever introducing it as philosophy in some technical sense, but instead as a reflective mode of living in order to develop, you might say, a compassionate life. How is it that we get out of ourselves enough to be able to ask the right sorts of questions that motivate us towards truth, goodness, and beauty? That's the point of this book. Now, This is water is a way of reminding us, that phrase is a way of reminding us that wherever we are taking things for granted. We're ignoring what is most obvious and presented to us in plain sight. And this is why when I define philosophers as those who take seriously what everyone else takes for granted, and I say that philosophers put question marks where everybody else puts periods, now you can understand what I'm getting at. It's this Wallace point, right? That everywhere we are, this is water. What is the content of philosophy? Whatever we encounter in life. It is life itself. It is thinking well in order to live well. And the only way that we can really do this is if we unpack what we take for granted, what we tend to ignore. So this is why I recommend This Is Water as the best starting place for philosophical study, because it's not fundamentally about how do we study philosophy, it's how do we live philosophically. And I think that that's ultimately what philosophy is all about. It is what Pierre Hadot calls a way of life. It is a kind of spiritual practice even, regardless of whether it's religious. It gets at what it is we take to be most essential about who we are. It's an invitation to think clearly where we are about where it is we hope to go. Or as Kierkegaard would say, it's all about becoming a self. So first and foremost, I recommend This Is Water. And in fact, what's really amazing is the actual audio recording of his commencement address is available here on YouTube. I will link it in the description below. So you don't even have to go buy the book. You can just watch it, and immediately after finishing this video, go check out This Is Water in David Foster Wallace's own voice. Now, I will say, most of my students keep that book. When we read it in class, they keep that when they sell back most of the other books that I assign. So you may want to get a copy as well. So I'll put a link to the book. So if you want to buy it and read it in print, you can as well. And as a way of closing then today, I want to recommend just a few other things that I think are kind of good encouragements to this philosophical way of living for people not trained in philosophy as this sort of technical practice, this technical discipline. The first is Anne Lamott's book, Almost Everything. This book is really fantastic, again, as a way of inviting us to think more deeply, to think more reflectively, and to think more intentionally about who we are and why it matters. It's about overcoming our temptations to the obviousness of our own ego, and she really does a great job of doing this in a literary way that is humorous and invites us to reflect, even when it then doesn't have to look like really serious academic work. Another book that I would recommend is by Wendy Farley, and it's simply called Beguiled by Beauty. And in that book, what she does is reflects on contemplation and meditation and slowness and silence as aspects of our life that we need to cultivate in order to live lives of empathy and engagement with others. So it's a great way, again, to rethink our pacing, to interrogate our normal, and to invite ourselves to a more ethical mode of living with other people. And finally, what I would recommend is any music you're already listening to. Listen to it with a fresh ear, with a new eye. Allow Wallace and Lamott and Farley to now encourage you to start letting those question marks show up. So when you hear that line, that lyric, that thing that you love, rather than just singing along and taking it for granted, maybe stop and say, what about this seems right? What does this get right about the human condition? How is this encouraging me in important ways, or raising my awareness in order to be critical about things that I would otherwise forget? So those are my encouragements. Philosophy is not something that you have to do in the college classroom, though that's a cool place to do it. It's not something that requires a PhD, though I highly recommend those. It's instead a way of living reflectively, living purposively, and interrogating what we tend so often to ignore. I hope this is helpful. I will see you next time, unless a piano falls on our heads.